My grandfather told me one thing about the iron box when I was 9 years old. He said, "That box opens when you need it to. You'll know." He was right. I knew on the morning the certified letter arrived. My name is Sadie Briggs. I was 18 years old. I had been on the farm for exactly 9 days when the letter came, and I had spent most of those 9 days trying to understand what I had inherited. Not the land itself. I understood the land in the way you understand something you have looked at your whole life without ever being taught to read it. What I did not understand was the silence my grandfather had built into every corner of it, the locked barn cabinet, the east field he never let me walk past the fence post with the orange cap, the iron box behind the rafters that I had touched exactly once as a child and never touched again. Dale Briggs had lived on Slade Hollow Road in Harlan County, Kentucky for 51 years. He had worked the Slade Hollow number 2 coal tipple for 19 of those years until the operation shut down in the spring of 1987. After that, he farmed beans, corn, a kitchen garden behind the house. He did not talk about the mine. He did not talk about much. He was the kind of man who communicated in tasks. If he wanted you to understand something, he handed you a tool and showed you where to stand. He died on a Tuesday in January. He was 79 years old. The ground was too frozen to bury him for 3 weeks, and by the time we did, the bank had already started drafting its letter. I got it on a Thursday morning, certified mail, which meant the drive in the farm truck, a 2003 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and 190,000 miles on it, 4 miles down Slade Hollow Road to the rural root box at the county junction. The return address was First Harlan Savings Bank. The loan officer's name was Gerald Decker. I sat in the cab and read it twice. The original loan had been taken out by my grandfather in 1991, restructured twice, and carried a final compounded balance of $28,700. Due date May 16th, 63 days from the date of the letter. I folded it back into the envelope. I put the envelope in the chest pocket of the barn coat I had taken from the hook by the back door, the one that still smelled like him, like engine grease and wood smoke and something mineral I could not name. Then I drove back up the hollow and sat in the truck cab in the mud beside the smokehouse for a long time without getting out. The farm was 44 acres. 6 of those acres were East Field, which the state of Kentucky had officially classified in 2009 as remediation grade, unsuitable for food crop production due to acid mine drainage from the Slade Hollow number 2 closure. The remaining acreage was timber, pasture, and the house lot, the barn, the smokehouse, the root cellar cut into the hillside behind it, and the iron box. I had not gone into the barn yet. Not really. I had opened the door twice, looked at the dark interior, and closed it again. Something about the barn felt like the inside of a conversation I had not been invited to join, but that Thursday afternoon, with the letter in my chest pocket and 63 written in my composition book, I went in. The barn smelled of old hay and chain oil and something faintly sweet, like dried Timothy grass left too long in a warm space. The light came through 2 gaps in the east wall where boards had warped away from each other over years of Kentucky weather. Enough light to see by, not enough to feel comfortable. I found the iron box on my third pass through the rafters. It was not large, maybe the size of a shoebox, made of sheet steel, the seams welded rather than folded. The surface was orange-brown with rust, except along one edge where something had rubbed it clean over years of contact. A hasp latch, no padlock. I had remembered a padlock from childhood. There was none now. I set it on the workbench and stood there looking at it. The memory came back whole. I had been 9, maybe 10, a Saturday in late summer. I had climbed the loft ladder looking for a lost cat and found the box sitting on the rafter shelf, and I had reached for it because children reach for things, and my grandfather's voice had come up from below, quiet and exact, the way he said everything. "Don't touch that yet, Sadie." I had pulled my hand back. I had asked him what was in it. He had said, "That box opens when you need it to. You'll know." I was 29 days past his death and 63 days from losing everything he had left me, and I opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a piece of canvas cut from a feed sack, were three things: a leather-bound notebook, the kind with the strap closure, dark brown, swollen slightly along the spine as though it had gotten wet once and dried slowly, a white envelope, sealed, with my name written across the front in his handwriting, and a small brass ring holding three keys, each one different, each one old enough that the teeth had worn smooth at the peaks. I took all three to the kitchen table. I opened the envelope first because it had my name on it. The letter inside was written on 3 sheets of yellow legal paper, both sides, in my grandfather's block printing that leaned slightly right when he was working something out carefully. The date at the top was March 14th, 2019, 4 years before he died. He had written this when I was 13 years old and sealed it and put it in that box and waited. I read it standing up, still in the barn coat, and I did not sit down until the 3rd page. He started with the mine. The Slade Hollow No. 2 tipple had employed 140 men at its peak. When it closed in April of 1987, the acid drainage that had been contained by active pumping began to migrate. Within 18 months, it had worked through the subsoil of the East Field and poisoned the pH to a level where nothing useful would grow. Dale had gone to First Harlan Savings Bank in September of 1987 to ask about a remediation loan, something to cover the cost of limestone and soil amendments while he brought the field back. Gerald Decker had been the loan officer. He was new then, 26 years old, and he had made his decision before Dale finished explaining. He had written up a classification document, typed on bank letterhead, stating that the East Field was permanently non-arable due to industrial contamination and had no viable agricultural future. He had used that classification as grounds to deny the loan. He had suggested Dale consider selling. Dale had not sold. Instead, he had gone to the county co-op and bought 50-pound bags of powdered agricultural limestone on credit, 1 or 2 at a time, as he could afford them. He had started spreading it that October. He had begun keeping records in a notebook. He wrote in the letter, "I did not tell anyone what I was doing because I knew what would happen if the bank found out the land was recovering before I could pass it to you. A piece of land classified as remediation grade carries a depressed value. A piece of land reclassified as productive agricultural carries a different value entirely. And men like Gerald Decker have long memories for property they once said was worthless." He wrote, "The notebook will show you what I did and how far the field has come. The keys will show you where I kept the proof. When the bank comes, and they will come, do not sell. Open the box. Read the notebook first, then go to the county clerk with the small key on the brass ring." The letter ended, "I am sorry I kept this from you. I needed you to come to it the way I came to it, without anyone telling you it could not be done." I put the letter down on the kitchen table and looked at the window for a while. The East Field was not visible from the kitchen. I would have to walk out to the fence post with the orange cap to see it. I had not done that yet. I opened the notebook. He had started it on April 4th, 1988. The first entry was 4 lines. East Field, Grid A through F. pH, tested at 3.9 using litmus strips from the Harlan Co-op. Acid migration confirmed through upper 8 inches of topsoil. Beginning limestone application today. 40 pounds, broadcast, over grid A. That was it. 4 lines. 15 years of entries followed. I read until midnight. I made coffee at some point and let it go cold without drinking it. The kitchen had gone fully dark around me, and I had not noticed. I turned on the overhead light and kept reading. What he had done was not complicated in concept. It was complicated in time. Every spring he broadcast agricultural limestone across the field in measured quantities, working grid by grid, recording the weight applied and the approximate coverage. Every fall, he added wood ash from the farmhouse stove, raked in before the first freeze. Starting in year 6, he had added compost from a pile he maintained on the north side of the barn, what he called in the notebook the mother batch. A single casual reference that assumed the reader already knew what it meant. The pH climbed in increments that required patience to appreciate. Year 1, 3.9. Year 2, 4.2. A plateau in year 4 that lasted 2 seasons and seemed to trouble him. The entries shorter that period, more clipped, the handwriting tighter. Then in year 5, he wrote a single sentence that stood apart from the rest. The land is not refusing. It is processing. I will wait. By year 7, after he shifted the limestone application to early spring rather than late fall, the number moved again. 5.1. He recorded it with no commentary, just the figure and the date, but the handwriting on that page was larger than usual, as though his hand had loosened with something close to relief. Year 9 brought another entry that stopped me. October 14th, 1997, grid C and D showing measurably different texture at 6 inches. Earthworm activity confirmed in grid E. He had drawn a small line under that last sentence, the only underlining in the entire notebook. Not dramatic, just deliberate. A man marking the moment the land started answering back. By year 10, the reading was 5.6. By year 13, 6.0. The last entry was dated September 9th, 2003. It read Eastfield pH at 6.2. Heavy metal drawdown appears complete in upper profile, ready for Kennebec. She will find this when the bank comes. She always does in this family. I set the notebook down. She, not my mother. My mother had left Harlan County when I was 4 and had not come back. Not my grandmother, who had died in 1996. Just she. A placeholder for whoever was going to be standing in this kitchen when the letter arrived. He had written that in 2003. I had been born in 2005. I sat with that for a long time. A man writing towards someone who did not yet exist. 15 years of work aimed at a future he could not see but chose to believe in anyway. I did not have a word for what that was. I still do not. I only know that sitting at that kitchen table at midnight with his handwriting in front of me, I felt the full weight of it settle onto my shoulders, and I did not want to put it down. I closed the notebook and went to bed without eating, and lay there in the dark thinking about the kind of patience that does not ask to be witnessed. In the morning, I drove to the County Agricultural Extension Office on Cumberland Avenue in Harlan. The parking lot was half mud. I carried the notebook wrapped in a dish towel because it felt fragile in a way that had nothing to do with its physical condition. The extension agent was a woman named Nora Vaughn, mid-30s, reading glasses pushed up on her head that she seemed to forget were there, the look of someone who had argued with bureaucratic paperwork for long enough that the paperwork had started losing. I told her I had 44 acres on Slade Hollow Road. She looked at me carefully and said she was familiar with the property. I put the notebook on her desk and told her my grandfather had been running a soil remediation project on the East Field since 1988. The last pH reading in the log was 6.2. The compost pile on the north side of the barn was still active. I had 62 days. She put her glasses down and opened the notebook and read for 9 minutes without speaking. I counted because there was nothing else useful to do with my hands. She reached the pH progression tables. The columns Dale had kept by season, 1 entry per spring, the numbers climbing in small increments across 15 years. She slowed at year 7, where the methodology shifted. She stopped entirely at the final entry. She said it quietly, as though telling herself rather than me, he actually did it. She ordered soil cores that afternoon, 6 sampling locations across the East Field, sent to the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Laboratory in Lexington. Results would take 5 to 7 business days. She told me not to do anything to the field until they came back. I drove home and walked the farm for the first time the way my grandfather used to walk it, not going anywhere in particular, just moving through it and touching things. The truck by the barn, the smokehouse wall, still solid, the root cellar hatch set into the hillside. Its iron ring rusted the color of dried blood. The mother batch on the north side of the barn, heaped dark and dense against the cedar planks. I pushed my hand 6 inches into its center and pulled it back fast. Warm, actively warm in early March after sitting untouched through 3 winters. I stood there with my hand smelling of black earth and understood for the first time that my grandfather had not left me a problem. He had left me the solution to a problem he knew was coming, and he had spent 15 years building it without telling a soul. I went inside and wrote in my composition book, Day 1, 63 days remaining, 1 notebook, 1 pile, 1 field, 3 keys. Do not know what the keys open yet. The lab results came back on a Wednesday. Nora called at 7:08 in the morning. East Field, pH 6.2. Heavy metal concentrations below threshold for food crop production. Organic matter content elevated, consistent with sustained amendment over multiple seasons. The 2009 state assessment had recorded a pH of 4.3. That assessment had been conducted using the 1987 classification document prepared by First Harlan Savings Bank as its baseline. No independent soil sampling had been conducted for that assessment. She paused after she said that last part. Let it sit there for a moment. Then she said Kennebec potatoes, suited to low pH recovery soils, high yielding, growing window of 60 to 70 days, for 6 acres at standard seed spacing. I would need 200 pounds of certified seed. Bluegrass seed supply in Pineville would likely have Kennebec this time of year. I drove down the following morning in the farm truck, which had spent the weekend sitting in the mud long enough to build 2 shallow trenches beside the barn. The engine caught on the second try. I took it as a reasonable sign. Pineville is a town that has been making up its mind about staying for about 40 years. The seed supply was at the south end of Main Street in a low tan building with a gravel lot. The man behind the counter was somewhere in his 60s, glasses on a chain, a vest the color of dried corn. His name was Cobb, just Cobb, stitched onto a patch above the breast pocket. I told him what I needed, 200 pounds of certified Kennebec seed potato. He looked at me over the glasses and asked where I was farming. Slade Hollow Road, Harlan County. He nodded slowly. The kind of nod that is a delivery mechanism for something the person has already decided to say. The soil out that way, near the old number 2 tipple, was not really suitable for food crops. He had heard that from more than one person. He said it matter-of-factly, without cruelty, the way someone repeats a fact they have never thought to verify. I told him I had soil test results from the University of Kentucky laboratory showing a pH of 6.2. He looked at me for a moment, then he went to the back. While he was gone, the door opened behind me and a man came in, large through the shoulders, somewhere in his mid-60s, with a face that had settled into an expression of mild and permanent skepticism, clean work boots and a good barn coat, not his working one. I had never met Warren Holden, but I knew the name. He owned the 90 acres adjacent to our west boundary and had made 2 written offers to purchase the Briggs property in the past 4 years, both during periods when the estate was in administrative limbo. He stopped when he saw me. His eyes moved from my face to the notebook on the counter and back. Cobb returned with the sacks on a flatbed cart. He looked at Holden, then at me, and opened a conversation about the old Briggs place the way a man opens a door he expects others to want to walk through. Holden said he had made a fair offer on that property. $140,000 for 44 acres of classified land was more than fair. He said it the way a man says something he has practiced being reasonable about. I signed the receipt. $194 for 200 pounds of certified Kennebec seed potato. Cobb said, while I was signing, that it would be a shame to spend that kind of money on ground that would not produce. He said it in Holden's direction rather than mine. Holden looked at the counter and said nothing. I loaded the sacks into the truck bed without asking for help. Each bag was 50 pounds. 4 bags. My arms were shaking by the fourth one, but I did not put it down until it was in the bed. I thanked Cobb. I nodded at Holden. I drove north. The seed rode in the truck bed for 3 days while I prepared the east field. I found the walk-behind garden cedar in the barn on the second day, hung on the wall behind the disc harrow, still carrying a paper tag with the year of purchase in my grandfather's hand. 1994. I cleaned the seed plates, oiled the drive chain, replaced the marker wheel that had cracked at the hub. It took most of an afternoon. Then I worked the field. The rear tine tiller opened the soil along the rows. The earth turned dark and complicated, the smell of it not chemical the way I had expected, but dense and organic, like something long covered coming back to the surface. I laid the rows by hand measurement, spacing them 34 inches center to center the way Nora had specified. I cut the seed pieces the evening before planting, 2 eyes minimum, dusted them with sulfur powder from the barn cabinet, let them cure overnight on the smokehouse floor. I planted over 3 days. The first morning I started at the north end of the field at first light, working south along the rows. The cedar dropped each piece at 12-inch intervals, covered it, moved on. The sound it made was a low mechanical rhythm, steady as a clock. I walked every row twice, once to drop and once to check depth with my hand. The soil was loose and dark and held the shape of my fingers when I pressed into it. The second day, my back had started to understand what I was asking of it. I worked slower. I stopped twice to sit on the fence post at the east boundary and drink water and look at what had been done so far. The turned rows stretching south. Not beautiful exactly, but purposeful, the way a thing looks when it is being done correctly. The third day I finished by early afternoon. I walked the full length of the field once, north fence to south fence, not counting rows, just moving through it. Then I walked back to the house and sat on the back step without moving for a while. That evening, I wrote in the composition book, 6 acres planted, Kennebec, certified, 200 pounds, day 14, 49 days remaining. Below that, I wrote the 3 things I did not know yet, what the 3 keys opened, whether the field would produce at the rate Nora had named, whether 49 days was enough. Below that, I wrote a line I had found that afternoon in the notebook, written sideways in the margin in different ink, added years after the original entry, in smaller print as though he had run out of room. The land does not forgive quickly, but it does not forget either. I set the composition book on the table next to the iron box, which I had left open with the canvas wrapper folded beside it. The brass ring sat where I had put it on day 1. Small key, worn at the tip, medium key, newer metal, large key, heaviest, with a tag hole at the top that held a loop of old wire. None of them matched any lock I had found on the property. Outside, in the dark, a vehicle slowed at the end of the drive. No headlights turned in, just the engine, idling for a moment, then moving on. I knew the sound of that truck. I wrote one more line before I went to bed. Warren Holden drove past at 9:14. Then I closed the book and turned off the kitchen light, and the farm went quiet around me, the way farms do when the work of the day has been done and nothing yet has gone wrong. The days after planting had a different quality to them. Not easier, just different. The work before planting had been about decision, about whether to believe what the notebook said and act on it before the soil test came back, before anyone confirmed what Dale Briggs had spent 15 years building in silence. That part was done. The seed was in the ground. What remained was the particular tension of waiting for something living to decide whether it agreed with you. I checked the field every morning, not because there was anything to see yet, but because it was the only useful thing I could do before the coffee finished brewing. I walked the north fence line, looked at the rows, walked back. I kept the composition book updated each evening. Soil temperature, air temperature. Whether anything had changed, nothing changed for 7 days. On the morning of day 21, I went out at first light and the field had changed. Not dramatically, Not the kind of change you could photograph and have someone understand from a distance, but standing at the north fence with the light coming flat and low across the rows, I could see a color shift, a faint green, barely there, running along the tops of the mounded rows where the soil had begun to crack in the particular way that means something underneath is pushing up. I stood at the fence for a long time. Then I went inside and called Nora Vaughn. She came out that afternoon and walked the rows without speaking for several minutes, crouched down twice, once near the center of the field and once near the south boundary, pressed her fingers into the soil beside a cracking mound, looked at what came up on her fingertips. The stand looked uniform, she said, and uniform emergence on a recovery soil was not something she encountered often. If the weather held and the plants reached expected height by the first week of May, a yield assessment was on the table. I wrote that down. She looked at the field one more time before getting back in her truck, said his name the way people say something they have been thinking about for a long time before saying it aloud. Dale Briggs. Then she drove out. I took 12 photographs that evening, standing at the north fence in the last of the light. The green was more visible by then, low and tentative, but real. On day 24, a man I had never seen came up the drive in a white pickup truck with a University of Kentucky agricultural extension decal on the door panel. He introduced himself as Dr. Philip Slater, independent soil consultant, conducting regional assessments for the Extension Office, following up on recent soil test activity in Harlan County, wanting to take verification samples from the East Field as part of a standard protocol. He had a letter on Extension Office letterhead. It looked right. The signature at the bottom was smudged enough that I could not read the name clearly, but the formatting was consistent with documents Nora had given me. I called her before I let him pass the fence. She answered on the third ring. She did not have a Philip Slater on her regional contact list, but the extension system used outside consultants, and it was not unusual for her not to know all of them. If his credentials looked legitimate and he was only taking soil samples, there was no particular reason to refuse. I let him in. Slater was methodical and quiet. He carried a core sampling kit in a hard-sided case and worked quickly, moving from point to point along what appeared to be a predetermined grid. He was in the field for about 40 minutes, 6 core samples. He thanked me, handed me a card with a Lexington number, and drove back down the hollow. I watched his truck until it dropped below the ridge. Then I stood at the fence post with the orange cap and looked at the field, trying to locate the 6 sampling points. Something was wrong with the spacing. I walked the field that evening after supper, starting at the north boundary and moving south. I found 3 of the sampling holes easily, the displaced soil still fresh around the edges, but the 3 I expected to find in the eastern section, the section closest to the original acid drainage path, the section Dale had worked hardest in the early years. Those holes were not where they should have been. They were west of the old board fence line, not on the east field, on the narrow strip of transition ground between the amended east field and the untreated pasture running toward the property boundary. I stood there in the low light and looked at the ground. The amended east field sat east of an old board fence, most of it rotted to the post stubs now, that Dale had put up in the early years of the remediation project. The strip of ground west of that fence had never been treated. It was original contaminated soil, the starting point. The 3.9 pH ground the notebook described on its first page. Slater had taken 3 of his 6 samples from that strip. I went inside and wrote it in the composition book. Slater sampled west of the board fence line, 3 of 6 points, transition ground, not amended field. Below that, I wrote, "Tell Nora in the morning." I called her at 7:15. I described the fence line and the sample locations as precisely as I could. She went quiet for longer than usual. She said she would drive out. The extension agent came the next morning and walked the field herself, going directly to the locations I had described. She crouched at the post stubs and looked at the soil profile on either side. Took photographs. took her own core samples from 4 points, all of them east of the old fence line, all within the amended boundary. She did not say much while she worked. When she was done, she stood at the field edge and looked at the green rows for a moment. She said she was going to send her samples to Lexington marked priority, not to contact Slater and not to contact the bank until results came back. Keep the composition book updated and document anything else that seemed out of place. Then she got in her truck and drove out, and I went back to work. 8 days later, on a Tuesday morning that started at 41 degrees and did not get warmer, the bank's second letter arrived. Decker had written it himself this time, 2 paragraphs, tight and legal in their construction, but personal in the way a warning is personal when someone wants you to understand it is coming from them specifically. The bank had received an independent soil assessment from a certified agricultural consultant. The assessment indicated that pH readings across the east field were inconsistent with productive agricultural use and that heavy metal residuals remained above the threshold for food crop classification. Based on this new information, the existing extension agreement was under review, a final determination within 14 days. I read it standing at the kitchen counter with my coat still on. Then I opened my grandfather's notebook to the first page and read the opening entry again. East Field, grid A through F, pH tested at 3.9, grid A through F. He had marked the grid in the field. I had seen the old paint marks on the post stubs when I walked the boundary. The markers ran east from the old board fence. Every measurement in the 15-year record had been taken east of that fence. Slater had sampled the ground Dale had started from, not the ground Dale had spent 15 years changing. I put on my boots and went outside. The field was at its best in that third week of growth, plants at 6 inches, some reaching 7. The leaves dark green and beginning to arch outward from the stem in the way healthy potato plants do when the root system beneath them has found what it needs. Standing at the north fence, looking south across 6 acres of it, it was difficult to understand how anyone who had seen this field could submit a document saying it was non-viable. But Slater had not sampled this field. I went back inside and looked at the brass ring with its 3 keys. Small key, worn at the tip. My grandfather had written "Go to the county clerk" with the small key. I had been waiting for the right moment without knowing what the right moment looked like. This was it. I put the small key in my coat pocket and drove to Harlan. The county clerk's office was on Central Street, a 2-story building that smelled of old paper and floor wax. The woman at the front counter directed me to the record storage room on the lower level, a private document storage box rented under the name Dale Briggs. The box was in a row of identical metal cabinets along the west wall. The small key opened it on the first try. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that had once been brown and was now the color of old cream, was a collection of documents held together with a single rubber band that disintegrated when I touched it. I set everything on the reading table and went through it piece by piece. Property deeds, original and copies. Going back to 1962, a hand-drawn survey map of the 44 acres dated 1971 showing the east field boundary exactly as I knew it. The old board fence marked clearly as the western edge of the remediation zone. Photographs, 32 of them, black and white and color both, dated on the back in Dale's handwriting, one from each spring from 1988 through 2003. The east field in each, taken from the same position at the north fence post. Year 1, gray, dead, flat. Year 7, a faint irregularity in the surface. Year 13, something that was beginning to look like ground with a future. And at the bottom of the stack, paper-clipped separately, a single document I had to read 3 times before I understood what I was holding. A copy of the meeting record from September 11th, 1987. Dale Briggs and Gerald Decker. First Harlan Savings Bank. 2 pages typed on bank letterhead. At the bottom of the second page, in a section headed Basis for Classification, the loan officer had written East Field assessed as permanently non-arable, industrial contamination, no viable agricultural recovery projected, classification confirmed without independent soil testing, Applicant advised to consider property liquidation. Confirmed without independent soil testing. He had written that himself, signed it himself, and that document, that single line, was the foundation on which every subsequent assessment of the East Field had been built, including the 2009 state classification, including Slater's report. The whole structure went back to a 26-year-old loan officer's opinion, written without data, in 1987. I sat at the reading table for a long time. Then I photographed every document with my phone, put everything back in the box, locked it, and drove home. That night, the temperature dropped. The forecast had called for lows in the upper 30s. What arrived was different. At 11 in the evening, the thermometer on the back porch read 34 degrees. At midnight, it read 31. I stood at the back door in the barn coat and looked at the sky, which had gone clear and hard, the kind of clear that means the cold is not finished arriving. Potato plants can survive a light frost if the soil temperature holds. Anything sustained below 28 degrees at ground level will kill the foliage and set back root development by weeks I did not have. I went to the barn, 2 rolls of plastic sheeting, the thin kind used for silage covering, and a stack of old wooden lath strips. I made 4 trips between the barn and the field, and then I started working. Row cover laid by hand in the dark is slow work. The lath strips had to be pushed into the soil at intervals to hold the plastic above the plant tops, not pressing down on them, creating a tent rather than a compress. I worked north to south, row by row, crouching and standing and crouching again. The cold had settled to a particular stillness. No wind, just wait. My breath came in short clouds that dissolved immediately. At some point, I realized I was talking out loud. Not to anyone, not to my grandfather, not to myself exactly. Just sound. The way sound becomes necessary when the silence gets heavy enough to feel like something leaning on you. By 2:30 in the morning, I had covered 4 of the 6 acres. My hands had lost their fine sensation, and I was working by feel and memory, gauging the tent height by the pressure of my palm against the plastic. I heard a vehicle on the road at some point, slowing near the drive, idling, moving on. I did not stop to look. I kept moving south. I finished the last row at 4:10 in the morning. I sat down on the ground at the south fence and put my back against the post and looked at the covered field, which in the dark looked like a low white landscape. All the rows flattened under the plastic into a single pale surface. The temperature on my phone read 27 degrees. I stayed where I was until first light began to show above the eastern ridge, then walked back to the house. Nora's truck came up the hollow at 5:40 in the morning. She saw me on the back step before I saw her. She parked, got out, looked at the covered field without asking what had happened, went to her truck and came back with 2 cups of coffee from a thermos, and sat down beside me on the step. We sat in the cold and drank and watched the light come up over the field. After a while, she said her samples had come back. East Field, grid points confirmed east of the board fence line, pH 6.2 across all 4 locations, heavy metal concentrations below threshold, organic matter content elevated throughout. Slater's 6 sample points, plotted against the county parcel map using his own filed coordinates, showed 3 of them falling west of the deeded Eastfield boundary, verified against the 1971 survey map. She had already written it up. I told her about the document from the county clerk, the 1987 classification, confirmed without independent soil testing. She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the covered field. That changes things considerably, she said. I told her I thought it changed everything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she needed to make some calls, not to contact Decker or Slater until she had spoken to the USDA field office in Lexington. Keep all the documents and keep the originals locked in the county clerk box. She finished her coffee and stood up. Before getting back in her truck, she said she did not know many people who would go out at midnight and hand cover 6 acres alone in the dark. I said I did not know of any other option. She drove out. I went inside and peeled off the barn coat and sat at the kitchen table. The third letter from Decker arrived that afternoon, hand-delivered by courier, one paragraph. The review period was concluded. Based on the independent assessment on file, the extension agreement was terminated. Full payment of $28,700 required by the original due date, now 9 days away. 9 days. I looked at the composition book, the iron box with its lid open, the brass ring with its remaining keys, the small one gone to the county clerk box, the medium and large ones still sitting where I had left them on day one. I picked up the medium key and turned it over in my hand. Then I looked at the wall beside the back door, where my grandfather had hung a row of small hooks for keys and tools. The hooks were mostly empty now, but on the second hook from the left, one I had walked past every morning for 30 days without registering, hung a short length of brass chain attached to a small steel plate. The plate had a number stamped into it. I put on my coat and drove to Harlan. The storage unit facility on Route 421 south of town was a low concrete building with roll-up doors along two sides. The medium key opened Unit 14. Inside, on industrial wire shelving, were four things. A second iron box, larger than the one from the barn, unlocked. Inside it, a binder holding 30 years of co-op receipts for agricultural limestone, wood ash purchases, and compost amendment materials. Every transaction dated and annotated in Dale's handwriting. I sat down on the concrete floor and went through the receipts one by one. The oldest ones brittle at the edges. The ink faded to the color of weak tea. Small purchases, most of them, $40 here, $60 there, one or two at a time, as he could afford them, across 3 decades of seasons. I calculated the running total in my head and stopped when I reached $14,000 because that was where my arithmetic became uncertain and the number had already become large enough to mean something. $14,000 spent on a field the bank had declared permanently worthless. A manila envelope holding the original 1987 loan denial letter from First Harlan Savings Bank, signed by Gerald Decker, with the classification document attached, and a handwritten note on a small piece of paper, recent ink, that said only, "This is what patience costs. It is cheaper than selling." I sat on the floor of the storage unit for a long time, the binder in my lap, the note in my hand. I thought about a man who had never told anyone what he was doing, who had driven to the co-op season after season and bought limestone and ash and never explained why, who had kept every receipt not because he expected to use them, but because he understood that someday someone would need to know what the work had cost, and he wanted them to know it had been worth paying. Then I loaded everything into the truck and drove home. And the 9 days left felt for the first time like something that might be enough. The note sat on the kitchen table next to the composition book for 3 days. This is what patience costs. It is cheaper than selling. I read it each morning before I did anything else, not because I needed the reminder, because it felt like the closest thing to a conversation I was going to get. 9 days became 8, then 7. The field came through the frost nights without visible damage. When I pulled back a corner of the plastic on the morning after the hard freeze, the plants underneath were upright and green, a little pale at the leaf tips, the way anything looks after a cold night, but alive. I uncovered the rows over the course of that morning, rolling the plastic back onto the lath frames. And by afternoon, the field was open to the sun, and the plants were already straightening toward it. Nora came out on a Wednesday afternoon, day 54, and sat at the kitchen table with a folder of her own. She spread 3 documents in front of me. Her soil assessment, the coordinate analysis showing Slater's sample points falling outside the amended field boundary, and a letter from the USDA field office in Lexington confirming that a formal inquiry into Dr. Philip Slater's assessment methodology had been opened. The inquiry would not move fast enough to affect the deadline. She said, what would affect the deadline was the yield assessment. If the harvest met the production threshold, 190 bushels per acre across a minimum of 1 acre. She could file a reclassification of the east field from remediation grade to productive agricultural that same day. A reclassified field would support a conservation loan application through the USDA Farm Services Office. She had already spoken to the field officer in Lexington, a man named Garrett, who had worked Harlan County cases before and had reviewed the soil test results and the 15-year amendment record. The application would move on an expedited basis given the documentation. The question was whether the field would yield what it should. I said I thought it would. She looked at me the way she had looked at me on the first day in her office, carefully, taking in something she was still deciding about. Then she said she would be at the farm at 7 in the morning on May 15th. Have the field ready. After she left, I walked the rows. The plants were at full canopy now, the leaves broad and dark green, the stems thick enough that the rows had lost their individual definition and become a continuous surface of growth. I crouched at the field edge and pushed 2 fingers into the soil at the base of a stem and felt the cool, hard resistance of a developing tuber against my fingertips. It was there. Whatever Dale had built in that soil over 15 years, it was there, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. I called Nora back that evening and told her to bring a hanging scale. The next morning, Warren Holden's truck came up the hollow at 8, not the slow evening pass he had made a habit of since the planting. He parked at the end of the drive and did not come to the door. He sat in the cab for a few minutes. I watched from the kitchen window. Then he got out and walked to the fence line that bordered his property and stood there looking at the east field. I went outside. We stood on opposite sides of the fence without speaking. The field was between us and the house, green and heavy and almost ready. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that has disproved a conviction he held for a long time. Not angry, something more complicated than angry. He said he had heard about Slater. I waited. He had recommended Slater to Decker. He said it as a statement of fact, not an apology, not a confession. The way a man says something when he has decided that not saying it would be worse than whatever came next. I said I knew. He had believed the land was finished. He had made the offer because he thought it was the responsible thing. Taking on acreage a young woman alone could not manage, land that had no agricultural future as far as anyone had told him. He looked at the field again, said the field would tell him what he needed to know better than anything else could. I said it would tell him in about 5 days. He looked at me then, not at the field. If there was anything he could do before the assessment, anything practical, he would do it. I told him the headland passes at the north and south ends of the rows needed to be worked before we could run the harvesting fork along the beds. The walk behind tiller could not reach the corners adequately. He had a proper tractor and cultivating shanks. If he wanted to do something useful, that was useful. He nodded once. He came back the following morning with the tractor. He did not come to the door first. I heard the diesel from the kitchen and looked out, and Holden was already moving along the north headland, the cultivating shanks turning the soil at the row ends clean and even. A man returning a favor he had not yet named out loud. I watched from the kitchen window, drinking coffee that went cold while I stood there. He was done in under 2 hours. He parked the tractor at the field edge, killed the engine, and walked back to his truck without coming up to the house. I went to the door. I said thank you. He raised a hand without turning around. Then he drove out. I wrote it in the composition book that evening. Holden worked the headlands, did not ask for anything, did not mention the offers. Below that day, 58, 5 days. I did not sleep well in those final days. The worry had been replaced by something more precise, a focused attention, the way you feel in the last mile of something long when the body understands that what it does now will be what it remembers. I checked the thermometer twice each night, walked the field each morning at first light, read sections of the notebook in the evenings not because I needed the information anymore, but because the handwriting had become a kind of company. On day 60, 2 days before the assessment, Decker's name appeared on my phone as an incoming call. I let it ring. He left no message. He called again that afternoon. I let it ring again. The third call came the following morning. Day 61. I answered it. He said he was calling to discuss the status of the account. His tone was measured, professional, the tone of a man who has practiced delivering bad news so often it no longer sounds like bad news. The bank's position had been clearly communicated and the payment timeline was firm. I told him I was aware of the timeline. He said he wanted to be sure I understood that the bank had no interest in acquiring the property through foreclosure, but that its obligations to its depositors required it to act on delinquent accounts without exception. I told him I understood. He said if I was considering any legal challenge to the classification of the property. The 2009 state assessment was a matter of public record and was the operative document. I said I was aware of the 2009 assessment and its basis. There was a pause. He said, what do you mean by its basis? I said the 2009 assessment had been conducted using the 1987 classification document as its foundation. I said the 1987 classification document had been prepared by his office without independent soil testing. I said I had the original document, signed by him, in which he had written confirmed without independent soil testing in the basis for classification section. The pause this time was longer. He said he would need to look into that. I said I thought he probably would. I said I would see him at the yield assessment Thursday morning at 7 a. Nora Vaughn had requested that a bank representative be present for the official reclassification filing. As the property was currently under a loan instrument held by First Harlan Savings Bank, he said he would send someone. I said I hoped he would come himself. I ended the call and set the phone on the table. Day 61. Field at full maturity. Decker called 3 times. Then I wrote one more line, because it was the thing I had been thinking since the conversation ended. He did not know about the storage unit. May 15th came in at 39 degrees. Frost on the windshield of the farm truck. The sky, the particular pale gray, that means the sun is coming but has not arrived yet. I was in the field at 5:30 in the morning, walking the rows by feel and memory, running my hands along the tops of the plants to check for frost damage. The leaves were cold and damp but upright. No collapse, no blackening at the margins. The soil was holding its temperature. I went inside and made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my grandfather's notebook open in front of me and waited for 7 o'clock. Nora arrived first, at 6:52 with a clipboard and a hanging scale and a county assessor's form. She explained it while setting up. The form required observed yield data from a minimum of 1 acre, recorded in her presence, to support the reclassification filing. If the numbers cleared 190 bushels per acre, she would sign and date the form on site and file it herself that afternoon with the county clerk. If they did not clear the threshold, the remediation grade classification would remain. She did not say what happened to the farm if the classification remained. She did not have to. She looked at the field. The plants were at their full height, hip-high in places. The leaves beginning to yellow at the tips, the way mature potato plants do when the energy has moved down into the tubers. She said that was what ready looked like. Gerald Decker arrived at 7:18 in a county mud-spattered sedan. He was a large man, heavier than I had imagined from his letters, somewhere in his early 50s, with the particular bearing of someone who has spent a long time being the person in the room who decides things. He wore a jacket and tie under a Carhartt vest that looked recently purchased. He looked at me, then at the extension agent, then at the field. He did not offer his hand. A U.S.D.A. field representative arrived at 7:24. Her name was Sandra Mercer, out of the Lexington office, mid-40s, with a tablet and a case holding her own sampling equipment. She introduced herself to each of us in turn, including Decker, whose name she said with a small pause after it that meant she knew exactly who he was and why she was here. Warren Holden came last. He parked his truck at the end of the drive and walked up without being asked, hands in the pockets of his barn coat. Nobody said anything about his presence. He stood to the side of the group and looked at the field. I started at the north end of the first row with the garden fork. The soil broke clean, the way prepared soil does when it has been properly amended and worked. No compaction, no resistance, just the fork going in and the earth turning open. The first hill gave me 7 tubers. The smallest was the size of my closed fist. The largest was longer than my hand, from wrist to fingertip. I set them in the bed of the farm truck, which I had pulled to the field edge. I moved to the next hill. Nobody spoke while I worked. Nora stood to my left with her clipboard. Sandra Mercer walked a parallel line 10 feet to my right, making her own notations. Decker stood at the field edge with his arms crossed. Holden watched from further back. By the time I had worked 100 feet of row, the truck bed had a layer of potatoes across its full width. Pale-skinned and heavy and clean. The way tubers look when the soil they came from was right. We weighed in batches on the hanging scale looped over the raised tailgate. Nora called the numbers out loud. I wrote them in the composition book. Sandra Mercer entered them on her tablet. First batch, 94 pounds. Second, 87 pounds. Third, 102 pounds. I kept working south. By mid-morning, the sun had warmed the field and the work had settled into a rhythm. Fork in, turn, lift, collect, move forward. My arms had found the pattern, and my mind had gone to the place it goes in sustained physical work. Not empty exactly, but simplified, reduced to the task and the numbers accumulating on the page. Decker walked the field edge at some point. I was aware of him moving along the boundary, looking at the rows, looking at the plants I had not yet lifted. He stopped near the old board fence, the rotted post stubs that marked the western boundary of the amended ground, and stood there for a while. I did not stop to watch him, but I noticed. Sandra Mercer came to walk beside me at around 10:30. She said she had reviewed the documentation Nora had submitted to the Lexington office. The GPS coordinate discrepancy in Slater's report was not something that could be attributed to instrument error. The inquiry that had been opened was now a formal investigation. I kept working. She said she also wanted me to know that the 1987 classification document had been reviewed by the field office legal team, a classification filed without independent soil testing, used as the basis for a loan denial and subsequently as the foundation for a state assessment, represented a significant procedural failure that the office took seriously. I said my grandfather had taken it seriously too. She was quiet for a moment. Then she went back to her parallel line. We finished the count at 11:40. Nora totaled the figures twice on her clipboard. I had written the same numbers in the composition book and came to the same total by a different sequence. 1,260 pounds of Kennebec potatoes from 6 acres of East Field. Nora looked at the total. She looked at the assessor's form. The yield, distributed across the planted acreage, exceeded the 190 bushels per acre threshold by a margin she described as substantial. She signed the reclassification form on the tailgate of the farm truck, using the wheel well as a hard surface. I watched her hand move across the form and the pen lift and noticed that I had been holding my breath since she began writing. She handed a copy to Sandra Mercer. She handed a copy to Decker. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Sandra Mercer said she needed to ask Decker a few questions regarding the 1987 classification procedure. They could do it here or arrange a more formal setting in Lexington. Her tone made clear the questions were not optional. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. I did not hear the questions, but I saw the moment he stopped answering them, his arms coming uncrossed, his hands dropping to his sides, his mouth closing on whatever he had been about to say. He had carried that single line, confirmed without independent soil testing, for 36 years without anyone requiring him to read it back out loud. Sandra Mercer had just required it. When it was done, Decker walked to his sedan. He did not shake anyone's hand. He did not look at the field again, or at me, or at the document in his breast pocket bearing his own signature. He got in his car and drove out, and I watched the sedan drop below the ridgeline and felt nothing in particular, which is the feeling that comes when something that has been wrong for a long time is finally, quietly, corrected. I watched Warren Holden walk slowly to the edge of the field and stand there looking at the overturned hills, the tubers still visible in the loose soil where I had moved too fast to collect everything. He crouched down and picked up a potato I had missed, turned it in his hand, set it on the top of the truck bed with the others. He said, without turning around, that Dale Briggs had been the most stubborn man he had ever known in his life. I said I thought that was probably accurate. He said he had never understood, in all the years he had farmed adjacent to this property, what the old man was doing out here alone in the east field every spring and fall. I said he had been fixing it. Holden turned around then. He looked at me with the expression he had worn when he read the pH table from the notebook over the fence line in April, a man recalibrating something he had been certain about for a very long time. He said he owed Dale Briggs an apology he could no longer deliver. I said Dale Briggs would probably have told him to put it towards something useful. He almost smiled, not quite, but almost. He said if I needed help with the rest of the harvest, he had a crew and equipment and nothing pressing until Friday. I said I would let him know. He walked back to his truck, sat in the cab for a few minutes, then started the engine and went slowly back down the hollow. And the sound of him faded until the only thing left was the field and the light and the smell of turned earth. Sandra Mercer came back to where I was standing at the truck bed and said someone from the office would be in contact. The expedited conservation loan application that Nora had submitted on my behalf would be processed with the reclassification documentation attached. A decision within the week. Then she drove out, and the farm was quiet. Nora filed the reclassification at the county clerk's office that afternoon. She called at 4:15 to confirm it was recorded. The letter from the USDA Lexington field office arrived on a Thursday, 6 days after the assessment. The conservation loan had been approved. I drove to First Harlan Savings Bank on a Tuesday morning, day 62 of the 63 I had been given, 4 miles down Slade Hollow Road to the county junction, the same road I had driven 62 days earlier with the certified letter in my chest pocket. I passed the rural route box where I had collected that letter and looked at it through the window as I went by, an ordinary metal box on a post at a road junction in Harlan County, Kentucky. I thought about stopping. I did not stop. I drove on. I handed a certified check for $28,700 to the teller at the front window. Not to Decker. He was not at his desk. His office was dark. The teller gave me a receipt. I folded it and put it in my coat pocket and drove home. I pulled into the mud beside the smokehouse and sat in the truck cab before getting out, the way my grandfather used to sit before getting out, taking a moment to let the engine settle before asking anything else of the day. The east field was visible from the drive now that the plants were gone. The overturned soil, dark and open. The rows still legible in the late afternoon light. Warren's crew had come on Friday and Saturday and finished the harvest. The full yield across all 6 acres had gone to 3 buyers, the Harlan County Co-op, a grocery distributor out of Middlesboro, and a restaurant supply company in Lexington that Nora had connected me with. The figure I wrote in the composition book was enough to cover the operating costs of the farm through the following spring and leave a reserve I had not expected to have. I sat in the truck and looked at the field. 6 acres that a bank had declared permanently worthless in 1987. 6 acres that a quiet man had spent 15 years correcting, one season at a time, without telling anyone, without asking for credit, without seeing it finished. Then I got out and went to the hardware store in town. I bought a wooden picture frame, oak, $9. I brought it home and sat at the kitchen table and opened my grandfather's letter, 3 pages of yellow legal paper, still in the order he had written them. I read it one more time, all the way through, the way you read something you know you are going to put away for a long time. Then I framed the last page. The one that ended, "I am sorry I kept this from you. I needed you to come to it the way I came to it, without anyone telling you it could not be done." I hung it on the kitchen wall between the window and the wood stove, where the morning light would reach it. The iron box from the barn I put on the shelf beside the back door, lid open, the brass ring with its remaining keys inside it, the large key still unidentified, still patient, waiting for whatever it opened, whenever I needed to know. The leather notebook I put on the kitchen table, open, not to any particular page, just open. I looked at the three things for a while: the framed page on the wall, the open box on the shelf, the notebook on the table. Not a collection of objects. A map. The record of a man who had understood that the most valuable things cannot be rushed, cannot be forced, and cannot be taken from someone who has done the work of knowing what they are worth. He had assumed for 20 years that someone would come to find it. He had written it into the notebook in 2003, 2 years before I was born. "She will find this when the bank comes." He had been right. I wrote the final entry in the composition book that evening. Day 62, balance paid, field reclassified, loan closed. Below that, after a space, I wrote one more thing. He spent 15 years on the soil and 30 years on the receipts and 4 years on the letter. He never told anyone. He never asked for credit. He never saw it finished. I looked at that for a long time. Then I wrote, "I will not sell." I closed the composition book and set it on the table beside the open notebook and went to bed. And outside on Slade Hollow Road, there was no sound of any truck slowing at the end of the drive, just the spring dark and the creek running below the hollow and the particular silence of land that has been returned to itself and knows, finally, that it is home.
When I was young, I chased the horizon. Certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. I've known loss that left me broken, I've known fear that stole my breath, I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher, every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon, it learns to carve its way ahead. What seems a wall to those who fear it becomes a path for those who tread. The road was never meant to be easy, We're never separate all this time. The road was never meant to be easy. The storm was never meant to end. The battles were not sent to break me. They were sent to shape the man I am. Every trial is part of the journey. Every loss becomes a light. The mountain is not in my way. The mountain is the reason I can rise.